faint crackling sound jolts Sarah awake in the dead of night. She sits up, her heart racing, unsure if it was just a dream. But then she smells it. Smoke. Thick, acrid smoke begins to seep under her bedroom door. Panic floods her senses. "Max, where are you?" She calls out, her voice trembling. Suddenly, her scruffy rescue mutt, Max, bursts into the room, barking frantically. His soulful brown eyes are wide with urgency as he jumps onto the bed, tugging at the sleeve of Sarah's shirt with his teeth. "Max, what's going on?" She whispers, fear choking her words. The dog lets out a sharp bark and darts toward the door, pawing at it desperately. Sarah hesitates for only a second before grabbing her phone and following him. As they step into the hallway, flames illuminate the living room ahead, their eerie glow licking up the walls. Smoke fills Sarah's lungs, making her cough violently. She drops to her knees, struggling to see through the haze. Max, undeterred, stays close, nudging her with his nose and barking louder than ever. He guides her toward the front door, his instincts sharper than any human's in this moment of chaos. Just as Sarah stumbles out onto the porch, gasping for air, her knees give way. She collapses onto the ground, her vision swimming. Max circles her protectively, his body tense and alert. His eyes dart toward the house, where the flames are now consuming the roof. Will they both make it out alive? Sarah sat at her desk, the soft glow of her laptop illuminating her modest living room. Outside, the crickets sang in rhythm with the occasional hum of passing cars. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, but Sarah had grown used to it. At 32, she had built a simple life as a freelance writer. Her days were filled with typing and deadlines, but the evenings brought an unshakable loneliness. It wasn't until a year ago that she decided to take a leap of faith, a decision that would forever change her life. Max, her scruffy rescue dog, stretched out on the rug beside her. His wiry fur had a charm all its own, a blend of gray and brown that made him look perpetually tousled. But it was his soulful brown eyes that had captivated her when she first saw him at the shelter. Sarah could still remember the moment she met him. She had been wandering the aisles of the shelter, overwhelmed by rows of barking, eager dogs. Then, in the corner, she spotted Max. Unlike the others, he sat quietly, his eyes locked on her with an almost human intensity. "Are you sure about this one?" the shelter worker had asked. "He's been here a while. Skittish around people." But Sarah didn't need convincing. There was something in Max's gaze that mirrored her own, a quiet yearning to be understood. That first night at home, Max had hesitated to approach her. He paced the living room, sniffing every corner, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. But when Sarah finally sat on the floor, offering a hand and a soft, "It's okay," Max had cautiously crept closer. He nudged her hand with his nose, and in that small gesture, a bond was formed. Over the past year, Max had become more than a pet. He was her confidant, her protector, and the one constant in her life. When deadlines loomed and anxiety threatened to overwhelm her, Max had a way of sensing it. He would paw gently at her arm, his eyes pleading for her to take a break. Their evening walks became a ritual. Together, they'd wander the quiet streets of their suburban neighborhood, the golden hues of sunset casting long shadows. Max's tail wagged with uncontainable joy, and Sarah couldn't help but smile at his childlike enthusiasm for the simplest things. A squirrel darting up a tree, the rustle of leaves underfoot. Her small home, a single-story bungalow with a modest garden, reflected her personality. Quiet, unassuming, but full of warmth. The walls were lined with shelves of books and framed photographs, many of them featuring Max. But behind the coziness of her home lay the weight of her past. Losing her mother 2 years ago had left a gaping hole in Sarah's heart. It was grief that had driven her to the shelter that day, searching for something, someone, to fill the void. Max didn't just fill it, he mended it. She often found herself talking to him, sharing her thoughts and worries as if he could understand. And in his own way, he always seemed to respond. A tilt of his head, a wag of his tail, or a comforting nuzzle. One evening, As Sarah prepared dinner, she looked down to see Max sitting patiently by her side, his head resting on her knee. She chuckled and ruffled his fur. "You really are the best thing that ever happened to me, Max," she said softly. His tail thumped in reply, as if he understood every word. Max had saved her emotionally long before he would save her life. He was her loyal dog companion, her heartwarming dog tale in the making, though she didn't know it yet. That night, as Sarah settled into bed, Max hopped up beside her, curling into his usual spot at her feet. The sound of his steady breathing was a comfort she had come to depend on. Little did she know, the quiet of her suburban home would soon be shattered, and the bond they shared would be tested in ways she could never imagine. It started as a quiet night, just like any other. Sarah had fallen into a deep sleep, Max curled at her feet as usual. Outside, the faint hum of crickets filled the air, but inside the house, trouble was brewing. A sudden pop echoed from the living room. Sparks danced from a faulty electrical outlet, igniting a frayed curtain. The flames spread quickly, consuming the room with alarming speed. Smoke began to creep under Sarah's bedroom door, filling the house with a suffocating haze. Max's ears perked up first, followed by a low growl. His nose twitched as the acrid smell reached him, and he leapt to his feet, barking furiously. When Sarah didn't stir, Max jumped onto the bed, pawing at her arm with increasing urgency. "Max, what's wrong?" Sarah mumbled groggily, her brain still foggy with sleep. But the moment she opened her eyes, the smell hit her, sharp and alarming. Her heart raced as she sat up, coughing. Smoke had begun to cloud the room, and the faint orange glow of fire flickered through the crack beneath the door. Panic set in, but Max stayed focused, tugging at her sleeve with his teeth. Okay, I'm coming," Sarah choked out, grabbing her phone and stumbling out of bed. Max led the way, darting through the smoke-filled hallway. Sarah struggled to keep up, shielding her face from the growing heat. The crackling of flames grew louder, and the once familiar home now felt like a maze of danger. When they reached the front door, Max nudged it open with his nose. Sarah stumbled outside, collapsing onto the grass as fresh air filled her lungs. Tears streamed down her face as she turned back to see her house engulfed in flames. Within minutes, neighbors gathered, their faces illuminated by the glow of the fire. Firefighters arrived, spraying jets of water at the inferno. Sarah sat trembling on the curb, Max pressed close to her side. Her chest tightened as she watched her home, her sanctuary, her stability, reduced to smoldering ruins. It wasn't just a house. It held memories, photos, and pieces of her mother she could never replace. But then she looked at Max. His fur was singed in places, and he held one paw off the ground, a faint burn mark visible. Sarah's tears turned to sobs as she hugged him tightly. "You saved me, Max. You're my hero," she whispered. His tail thumped weakly against her leg. A firefighter approached, holding something in his gloved hands. "Ma'am, I think this belongs to you." Sarah's breath caught as she recognized the old photo album, edges scorched but intact. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing photos of her mother and childhood memories she thought were lost forever. "How did you find this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The firefighter glanced at Max and smiled. "Your dog pulled it out of the house. We found it in the yard." It's almost like he knew what mattered most. Sarah looked down at Max, who rested his head on her lap. His amber eyes stared back at her with a mix of exhaustion and something she could only describe as understanding. In that moment, Sarah realized Max wasn't just a loyal dog companion. He was her guardian, her savior. But as she ran her fingers gently over his burn mark, a question lingered in her mind. How had Max known? Was it instinct, or was there something deeper guiding him that night? The morning after the fire, Sarah sat on her neighbor's couch, staring blankly at the mug of tea in her hands. Her home was gone. The faint smell of smoke still clung to her hair and clothes, a haunting reminder of the nightmare she'd escaped. Max lay curled up on the rug by her feet, his injured paw bandaged after a quick trip to the vet. He hadn't left her side since the fire, and his amber eyes followed her every movement, as though he could sense her turmoil. The neighbor's home was warm and inviting, but it wasn't hers. Sarah felt the weight of everything she had lost. The security, the memories, the tangible pieces of her life. She sighed, reaching down to stroke Max's fur. "You've been through so much, haven't you, boy?" she murmured. Max wagged his tail gently but didn't take his eyes off her. In the days that followed, Max's behavior became increasingly unusual. He was more attentive than ever, pawing at her when she seemed lost in thought and nudging her purse repeatedly as if trying to tell her something. "Max, what are you doing?" she asked one afternoon, watching him dig his nose into her bag. He pulled out an old, worn business card and dropped it at her feet. Sarah picked it up, her brow furrowing as she read the name. Dr. Harris, Canine Behavioral Specialist. The card had been buried in her purse for years, a relic from a brief encounter with a family friend. Dr. Harris was a retired veterinarian who once specialized in training service and rescue dogs. Curiosity piqued, Sarah decided to pay him a visit. She didn't know what she hoped to find, but Max's odd insistence pushed her to follow through. At Dr. Harris's small clinic, Max sat calmly by Sarah's side, his ears twitching as the elderly vet examined him. "You adopted him about a year ago, you said?" Dr. Harris asked, running a hand through Max's wiry fur. "Yes, from the shelter. They said he'd been there for a while and was a bit skittish." Dr. Harris's brow furrowed in thought. "This dog seems very familiar. Do you mind if I check something?" Sarah nodded, curiosity turning to apprehension. Dr. Harris disappeared into a back room, returning moments later with a thick folder. He flipped through the pages, then paused, holding up a photograph. "This is Max," he said, showing her an image of a younger, less scruffy version of her dog. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? That's impossible." Dr. Harris smiled faintly. Max was part of a search and rescue team. He was trained to save lives during disasters. We thought we'd lost him years ago during a major flood. He went missing, and despite our searches, he never turned up, until now. Sarah stared at Max, her loyal companion, who had already saved her life in more ways than one. "He's a hero," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Indeed he is," Dr. Harris said. "It's rare to see this level of dedication in a dog, even among the best." Max was special from the start. Back at her neighbor's house, Sarah cradled Max's head in her hands. He looked up at her with those same soulful eyes that had drawn her in the day they met. She now understood there was a deeper story behind his quiet bravery. But Max wasn't invincible. His burn wound had started to worsen despite the vet's treatment. Sarah's guilt weighed heavily on her. "Hang in there, Max," she whispered, gently applying ointment to his paw. "I can't lose you. Not after everything." She spent sleepless nights nursing him back to health, feeding him, cleaning his bandages, and whispering words of encouragement. It was during one of those quiet nights, as Max dozed beside her, that she decided to look through the photo album he had saved from the fire. The edges were charred, but the pictures inside were intact. Flipping through the pages brought back a flood of memories. Birthdays, vacations, and quiet afternoons with her mother. But something felt off. The album was heavier than she remembered. Running her fingers along the back cover, Sarah felt a slight ridge. "What's this?" she muttered, carefully prying it open. Inside was a hidden compartment, and within it, a folded letter. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The familiar handwriting stopped her breath. It was a letter from her late mother. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she began to read, Max stirring at her feet as if sensing the gravity of the moment. What secrets did her mother leave behind? And how had Max known this album was the one thing she couldn't afford to lose? Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, the faint glow of the lamp illuminating the delicate letter in her trembling hands. Her mother's familiar handwriting leapt off the page, each word carrying the weight of love and wisdom. "Sarah, my sweet girl, life will challenge you in ways you cannot imagine. But you have always been stronger than you know. Never give up on love, even when it feels like it's out of reach. Follow the signs, they'll lead you to where you're meant to be. I'll always be with you. Tears streamed down Sarah's cheeks as she clutched the letter to her chest. It was as if her mother had reached through time, offering comfort and guidance when she needed it most. And now, sitting beside her, Max thumped his tail softly, as if to remind her she wasn't alone. The weight of the letter and the photo album took on new meaning. Max hadn't just saved her life during the fire. He had preserved a piece of her mother's spirit. Before she could fully process the emotional revelation, a frantic knock at the door startled her. Sarah opened it to find her neighbor, pale and trembling. "It's Lucy," the neighbor stammered, referring to her 6-year-old daughter. "She wandered into the woods behind the house, and we can't find her." Sarah's heart sank, and she instinctively looked down at Max. Despite his injured paw, he stood at full alert, his amber eyes sharp and determined. "Max," Sarah whispered, "can you help?" Max barked once, his tail wagging with urgency. Sarah quickly grabbed a flashlight and followed the group of neighbors into the forest, Max leading the way. The search was grueling. The dense trees and thick underbrush made it nearly impossible to navigate, but Max's instincts were unwavering. He sniffed the ground, ears twitching, and moved with a purpose that defied his injury. After what felt like hours, Max suddenly froze, his ears pricking up. He let out a sharp bark and took off toward a cluster of trees. "Lucy!" Sarah called, her flashlight catching a glimpse of the little girl huddled beneath a large tree, clutching her knees. Max reached her first, licking her face and wagging his tail wildly. The girl's cries turned to giggles as she hugged the scruffy hero. "Max, you did it!" Sarah exclaimed, tears of relief streaming down her face as she scooped Lucy into her arms. Back at the neighborhood, the community gathered to celebrate Max's incredible bravery. Children placed a makeshift medal around his neck, and neighbors showered him with treats and applause. Sarah watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. In that moment, she saw Max not just as her loyal dog companion, but as a living symbol of resilience, love, and courage. As the crowd cheered, Sarah knelt beside Max, stroking his fur gently. "You're more than a hero, Max. Your family." Max looked up at her with his soulful eyes, his tail wagging slowly, as if to say he understood every word. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Sarah's temporary home, casting a warm glow on the desk where she sat typing. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, the words pouring out of her like a flood she could no longer contain. The story was about Max, his journey from a rescue dog to a hero, his quiet strength, and the extraordinary ways he had changed her life. She titled it Max, the loyal dog who taught me to live. Each keystroke felt like a step toward healing. The process of writing wasn't just about sharing Max's story. It was about reclaiming her own. The trauma of the fire, the pain of losing her mother, the challenges she had faced. All of it now had meaning because of Max. When she wasn't writing, Sarah spent her time with Max at Dr. Harris's clinic. Though his injuries had healed, Sarah knew Max needed more. One afternoon, Dr. Harris approached her with an idea. "Sarah, have you ever thought about training with Max? He's a natural, and with your bond, the two of you could make an incredible search and rescue team." Sarah was taken aback. "Me? I don't know if I'm cut out for that kind of work." Dr. Harris smiled. "You already are. Max has been teaching you all along. Resilience, selflessness, and trust. I think you'd be great at it." After a long conversation and some encouragement, Sarah agreed to try. The training sessions were challenging but rewarding. Sarah learned to read Max's cues, and Max thrived in the structured environment, his tail wagging excitedly at every successful task. Their first real mission came sooner than expected. A local hiker had gone missing in the woods, and Sarah and Max were called to assist. It was grueling work, but when Max's bark finally broke the silence, Sarah's heart soared. They had found the hiker, injured but alive. That day, Sarah realized she and Max weren't just a team. They were a lifeline for others in need. Months passed, and Sarah's book was finally published. It became an instant hit, resonating with readers who were moved by the emotional dog story and Max's inspiring rescue journey. The book's success brought Sarah a renewed sense of purpose, but it was the community's response that truly touched her heart. People would stop her on the street to share their own stories of loyal dog companions, each tale adding to the legacy Max was building. One evening, as Sarah sat on the porch with Max by her side, she reflected on everything they had been through. "You know, Max," she said, running her fingers through his wiry fur, "I thought I saved you that day at the shelter. But the truth is, you've been saving me ever since." Max looked up at her, his amber eyes full of quiet understanding. His tail wagged gently, a silent acknowledgement of their unbreakable bond. Sarah smiled, the warmth of the moment washing over her. "Max didn't just save my life. He taught me how to truly live it." Subscribe for more videos of heartfelt stories and don't forget like this video. Thanks for watching.